Hello, Houston. 3 minutes ago, I was sitting in my office on the other side of campus because I forgot to bring along something I'm going to share with you here a little bit later, but I think you'll enjoy it and we'll have some fun with it. So in any case, at the end of the last lecture, I misread the clock because of reflections, and so I finished a minute earlier than I meant to. There are just a couple of things I wanted to go into, probably not a minute's worth, but we'll go directly to the visuals and I'll show you what I should have covered last time. And that is essentially the fourth way in which, still recovering from a fast bike ride. In essence, the fourth way in which the literature has, well, it's not even the fourth way, it's really a change of orientation. And that is that the manner in which memory is conceptualized now has really changed markedly. And it started with the proposals of Endel Tulving, who in fact developed what, for lack of a better word, I'm just going to call a process memory version of what the material is like. And so in essence, for Tulving's model, what he proposed were actually three different types of memory, quite different from the short-term, sensory, and long-term model. And in fact, as you'll see, he classified it very differently, mainly as on a basis based on how it came to you. That is why it was important for you to remember this information all of a sudden. And in essence, the first of initially two, eventually three types of memories that he proposed is what is referred to as episodic memory. And what episodic memory involves, kind of as hinted at by the title, is essentially what's happening in your life. What are the episodes of your life? And so basically what's there are mainly the information related to what's going on. So if I asked you, who did you eat breakfast with this morning? You'd be able to describe and identify, you ate alone in your apartment, or you ate with somebody, or several people. But even if you and I had shared breakfast together, in fact, my memory of that event would be different than yours. Because if we were sitting across the table looking at each other, I might be looking into the kitchen, you might be looking out the front window of the restaurant. So episodic memory is absolutely unique for each of us, totally. Even if it boils down to being nothing different than having a slightly different point of observation. But episodic memory essentially is looking at recall of personal information, the events that go on in your life. And in some ways, it's parallel in some ways to working memory, although there are exceptions to that. The second type of memory that he talks about is what's called semantic memory in his model, or you could think of it as a generic memory. That is where, for instance, all of your knowledge of language is possessed. If I name a word and ask you to tell me whether it's a noun, verb, adjective, or adverb, you're going to go into semantic memory to find the answer to that particular situation. So in general, if it involves stored knowledge, the general knowledge that we'll be talking about later, that essentially is what's involved in semantic memory, as this model is, as Tulving's model, and adopted much more widely as a result of the many different kinds of supporting research that have occurred. But those were the only two types of memory that were originally introduced in this model. And I think it's instructive. There's way too much information on the screen here, but I'll kind of talk you through it. This is just not a legal thing to present on the screen, but what it does is to highlight, if you want to get your magnifying glass out, I'll kind of read you through it to show you what the difference is between semantic and episodic memory. So for instance, if we look at the information source that is supplying each of those memories, the information source in episodic memory is basically your sensory experiences. What are you doing? By contrast, essentially semantic memory is where, in this model, comprehension is achieved. It gives you the rules by which to speak any particular language and so forth and so on. The informational units that are stored are essentially episodes or events, what's happening to you in episodic memory. But in semantic memory, it has to do with concepts, ideas, facts, laws of language, and so forth and so on. In terms of the organizational system that is used, it's time-related in episodic memory. You can remember a great deal of detail, maybe even some details about if you ate at a restaurant this morning, for instance. There are probably things that happened. Maybe a waiter or waitress unfortunately dropped a plate or something, and there was the emotion that's normally associated with that kind of error that we've all experienced at one time or another. But it's time-related. The details of that a month from now, if you relate to somebody that you ate with so-and-so at a restaurant today, are not going to include your memory of that broken dish in all likelihood. So this kind of memory is time related. On the other hand, semantic memory is much more conceptual. Like your teacher has been telling you for years, don't read for the details, read for the concepts. What are we trying to explain, and so forth. Well, semantic memory is set up to do that. So it's looking at organizing the information in a very different way. In terms of the memory's emotional content, and its content, I should say, and its importance, it's more important in episodic memory, as we're going to look at a little bit later here in a slightly different way, and it's less important in terms of semantics. That is, the words are the words are the words, and we don't tend to worry a lot about the emotions that are attached to it in most instances. The likelihood of forgetting is substantial in episodic memory. It's quite small in semantic memory, which would suggest then that in terms of other models that we've talked about, the semantic memory is much closer to the long-term memory that we're going to be talking about here for the latter part of today. But in any case, information in episodic memory is held relatively short-term for the most part, unless, as you know from the associative memory model, it is rehearsed enough so that the information is stored in long-term memory. The retention in semantic memory, by contrast, is long-term. Once it's in there, it's going to stay a long time. How do we test in the laboratory? We ask you to recall particular procedures when we're testing episodic memory. On the other hand, we're tending to tap into general knowledge in the semantic memory. And finally then, in terms of general usefulness, the episodic memory is less immediately usable for us. Certainly it's interesting to store our history and you know what's happened to us, but the more general knowledge that is more generally usable to us, I keep saying general here, the knowledge that is more usable for us is that which has been stored in the semantic memory. So that's a kind of a walking tour of the two major elements of memory as originally proposed by Endel Tulving. He subsequently came to realize, based on you know suggestions from other resources and so forth, other researchers and so forth, that there was another way in which you and I can store and organize and use information, and that has to do with what he calls procedural memory. One example of that is riding a bike. It's very hard to describe to people, but you and I can do it essentially automatically. That is in procedural memory. And it's different from the information we've described in episodic memory and semantic memory, because you certainly don't forget how to ride a bike, so it is long-term. But that skill is not generalizable in the way that semantic knowledge is. There's only one thing you can do when riding a bike, and that is balance, steer, and pray, I guess, depending on how steep the hill and how bad the brakes. But in essence, procedural memory include things like how to start a lawnmower engine, or something like that. So there are mechanical things, basically, that would be one way, I think, to divide the general content of procedural memory in terms of its overall usefulness. So at this point then, oh, there we go. Look, I even had a definition for you. Knowledge of how to do something. Some of these things I prep and some of them I don't. So in any case, what we're going to do now is to jump into where I should have started about 5 minutes earlier in terms of beginning to look at long-term memory. And in essence, as we look at this, I'm actually going to start with, well, actually, I'm going to do this slightly later, so hang with me a minute while I get organized here as I'm kind of rolling through the material. Oh, I am going to start with this. Okay, we're going to do this. What I'm going to ask you to do is to take the sheet that is in the back of your Cognitive Psych, the book. If you've turned in the independent project approval sheet, it's probably already the last sheet still in the book. I'd like you to tear that sheet out and do the following for me. I'd like you to essentially fold it along this line. You're going to find lines to the left. There are 3 columns of lines there. What I'd like you to do is actually fold it across the line. The current model has equal lengths. I'm going to divide that. I'm going to change it later. So the instructions I'll give you are based on a form that hasn't been created yet. But if you fold it right down the middle, you'll essentially have one stack of lines on one side of the sheet. And for your own benefit, if you have time while I'm just describing what's involved, what you may want to do is number from 1 to 20 down the left side of that first line. What I'm also going to ask you to do, however, is kind of folding it down that middle so that you end up with a sheet that looks like this. And what I'm also going to ask you to do is fold along the crease between the 2 shorter columns of lines, so that in essence what you'll end up with is this kind of an effect where there's a fold right here, this is overlapping another column that's like that, and then there is the half sheet that's facing away from us at the moment. In order to actually conduct the experiment that I'm going to here, the demonstration, what I'm going to ask you to do is to focus on this line. So we're going to fold these two out of the way. You'll be folded here, so and I didn't have time to draw, but you're going to be looking at the half sheet with just the long lines on it. It may help you to number it, but it's not absolutely crucial by any means. Now, bear with me a minute. What I'm going to do is to read you some instructions as soon as I can. Oh, I'm in the wrong section. That's why I'm having trouble here. I'm going to, in essence, as you know, here in class, we've already studied the importance of associations linked to a given word. That's one of the bases on which memory is thought to operate. I've become intrigued with them. My reading suggests that many people have studied what are called the primary associates. For instance, if I say table to you, it is very likely that your first association to that word, the one that you'll think of, is chair. That's true for about 76% of adult speakers of English. So chair becomes the first associate to table. If I say man, your first associate would be woman, of course. If I say salt, pepper, and so forth. So you can see that each of us has a lot of primary associates, words that tend to crop into mind when we hear other words. And these have been well studied. What I'm intrigued about is the fact that nobody seems to have studied what would be called the remote associates that may be activated by a word. These are the second, the third, even the fourth word that a stimulus word may make you think of. In fact, what I'd like to do is collect some data from you and see whether I can detect a pattern in the more remote associates that we have as a group of sharing English speakers. So I would like you to fold the paper. I hope you're ready by now, because I'm going to start giving you some stimuli here very shortly, but it should be the last sheet in the Cognitive Psych, the book. We'll talk later about why I call it that way. If you've turned in your independent project approval sheet, it should be the last one that you'll find. I've already given the instructions on folding it, so what I'm going to introduce is a general concept that I'd like you to write down on each line, and I'll just give you some examples here first, so don't be writing yet. But for example, what I might say is, give me your first association to colors of the rainbow. If the first color that you think of is red, then that would be the word I'd like you to write down. Or I might say, give me your second association to cities in Texas. If that made you think of Houston and then Austin, in that case, you would then write down Austin. Sometimes I may even ask you for your third association, but that'll be as far as I go in this particular example. So if I asked you for your third association to flowers, you might think of a rose, then of a carnation, and then a bluebonnet, us being Texans. So in that case, what you would do is write down bluebonnet. Okay? Do you have any questions? Do you understand what I'm proposing here? Okay. I want you, now I need to get my list here. Okay, what I'd like you to do, and I'm going to do them in order with time enough for you to respond here. Item 1, what I'd like you to do is give me your first association to a precious stone. First associate, precious stone. Number 2, I'd like you to give me your second association to a fish. Second associate, fish. Third, I'd like you to give me your third association to a state of the United States. Third associate, state among the United States. Fourth, I'd like you to give me your second associate to an insect. Second associate, insect. Fifth, I'd like you to give me your first association to a type of music. First associate, type of music. Sixth, I'd like you to give me your third association to an alcoholic beverage. Third associate, alcoholic beverage. Number 7, I'd like you to give me your second association to a color. Second associate, color. Number 8, I'd like you to give me your third association to a military title. Third associate, military title. Number 9, I'd like you to give me your first association to an article of clothing. First associate, article of clothing. Number 10, I'd like you to give me your second association to a sport. Second associate, sport. Number 11, I'd like you to give me your first association to a musical instrument. First associate, musical instrument. Number 12, I'd like you to give me your third association to a four-footed animal. Third associate, four-footed animal. Number 13, I'd like you to give me your first association to an occupation. First associate, occupation. Number 14, I'd like you to give me your third association to a weapon. Third associate, weapon. Number 15, I'd like you to give me your second association to an article of furniture. Second associate, article of furniture. Number 16, I'd like you to give me your second association to a type of fuel. Second associate, type of fuel. Number 17, I'd like you to give me your first association to a disease. First associate to a disease. Number 18, I'd like you to give me your third association to a vegetable. Third associate, vegetable. Number 19, I'd like you to give me your second association to a type of vehicle. Second associate, type of vehicle. And number 20, I'd like you to give me your first association to a part of the human body. First associate, part of the human body. Now, what I would ask you to do with that sheet is to put it face down. I want the print side down. And I don't want you to look at those words again. Even if we don't talk about them until the next lecture, I want you to put them in your notebook somewhere where you can get them back. But I don't want you to look at those again. And I'll show you something very impressive about your memory when we get done with that a little bit later. It is a demonstration. I'm not actually collecting data, but it is important that you keep that sheet without looking at it so you can retrieve it, because we're going to do some recall around that a little bit later. So what I want to do today now is to start out with an analysis of the factors that actually impact long-term memory, and there are a bunch of them. But I'm going to be examined particularly the process the processes, I should say, that influence long-term memory. For instance, first, what I want to do is to look at, I should say, the influences that result from long-term memory, or partly from long-term memory. The first thing that I want to look at is what's called the serial position effect, or SPE. Do you remember what that is? That, in essence, is it's reflected in the performance curve that results when you ask people to recall information which is, by its nature, in serial format. If it's not perfectly learned, but it's in a series, you tend to end up getting recall results that produce what is called a serial position effect. Any list of words, if your mom asked you to get groceries at the grocery store or something, 10 or 12 items, that would end up being a serial list if I just point blank asked you to name them all. Even potentially the words of a song verse become contributory to the serial position effect. If you think about singers of the national anthem at ball games, the Super Bowl or any major sporting event like that, if you think about that, every now and then there is news reports of somebody who has forgotten the words partway through the song or something. May I never be that singer, but it happens very occasionally. But if you think about it, it simply never happens on "Oh Say Can You See." That is, everybody knows the start to the national anthem. So "Oh Say Can You See" is easy. Okay? Likewise, Toward the end, we hear verses like, "Oh, say does that star-spangled banner still wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave." That's the trail off at the end of the main verse of the national anthem. The screw-up in forgetting that anthem, when it occurs, happens somewhere around rockets' red glare or the bombs bursting in air, down in the middle of the song. To show you the greater difficulty, do you know the next word that follows after bombs bursting in air? Then you have to go back to the beginning and recite the whole thing, don't you? Gave proof through the night that our flag was still there, and so forth. It even shows up in long words. I won't humiliate any of you, but later today, turn to one of your friends and right out of the cold blue ask them to spell convenient. That is my favorite of all words because it sounds so easy. C-O-N, that's easy. And then it's V-E, well, no, wait a minute, is it V-E-I-N, is it V-I-E, is it V-E, what is it? So what you tend to hear when you're listening to somebody spell convenient is they lead into it with great bravado, okay? C-O-N-V-E, and that's about when you get to the And if you look back at the serial position effect, you're seeing it exactly, and in that case, it's 10 letters that they're trying to get organized and not able to. And of course, by the time they get to the end of the word, they can rip off, and do so typically fairly easy, I-E-N-T. It's in the middle where the confusion exists, and there's several reasons why that happens. What I'd like to do is really cover a couple of different topics, in some ways related to the serial position effect, that actually kind of bridge the gap between working memory and long-term or relatively permanent memory. And we're going to actually subdivide that into a couple of different types. Today we'll be looking strictly at long-term storage and some of the decay curves on that, but later we're going to look at very long-term storage. I'm old enough to have very long-term storage. Most of the viewers may not be. But there is actually one study we'll show you later that I love. It's one of my favorites, where an investigator at Ohio Wesleyan went back and got high school pictures of graduating seniors stretching back as much as 40 or 45 years, and then gave people the opportunity to look through a list of randomly scheduled, selected pictures from another school, same general dress style, different part of Ohio, at the same graduation. And he put them together and asked them to identify, yes or no, did you go to high school with these people? And the data is quite stunning in that kind of a resource, a test, I should say. But we're going to, in that case, we'll be looking at a very specific kind of very long-term storage of information. Well, English is stored in you permanently as speakers of English. That's a very long-term memory for you. And as long as you keep using it, it isn't a problem. I'm getting off topic. Don't let me do that. What I want to do is to start by reviewing a study that we presented earlier here in a previous discussion, and I want to build from that study to another. Both of them are useful in explaining the serial position effect. I want to remind you about a study we looked at earlier. I'm pretty sure we did by Craik and Watkins, who in 1973 did a study where they simply gave subjects 12 lists, each list being 12 words, one at a time, to be studied. They were encouraged as they were going through the list, because it was allegedly studying the effects of rehearsal, and so they were encouraged to rehearse these things actively. They were also told, as was true in the experiment, that the last 4 words in each list of 12 were especially important. And in order to stress that, what the investigators did was to actually print the last 4 words in a slightly different print style so that they stood out. They were very clearly identifiable as the last 4 items in the list. Now, there were 2 different recall conditions in this particular study. One of them was simply immediate free recall. That is, you could recall the words right after you had finished studying them to a perfect recitation, put them away, and recall immediately the entire list of 12. In the other case, what they were given was immediate free recall, but it's a kind of a misnomer. It isn't actually, it's delayed free recall is what it is. And in essence, what they were asked to do, once they finished and put the list away, they then had to wait 20 seconds. And then they could dump them out any order as rapidly as they wanted. For this, the subjects were in this delayed condition. They were specifically encouraged to not waste time. That is, that wasn't used so much, but to rehearse the words. That is, they were encouraged yet again that rehearsal is important, and certainly those last 4 words. So they were encouraged during that 20-second delay to actually rehearse the words. Then came a surprise. Psychologists are full of these. After the 12th list, after the recall of the 12th list, the subjects were then hit with instructions essentially saying, surprise, we'd like you to recall all of the words in all of the lists that you've seen. So they were actually presented with the opportunity, the challenge, to recall 144 words that they had been working with in that situation. Now the demonstration, the data that I want to show you here on screen looks like, oh, sorry, I did get the serial position effect here first. Oh, there we are. Okay, I was jumping ahead of myself in terms of what's being presented here. This is what they found with immediate recall. Okay, that is, in that particular case, they get a kind of a strange serial position effect, partly biased by the fact that the last four words were so heavily rehearsed. And so in this case, you can see just from looking at that data that if you count backwards from the end of the list four words, you'll notice that there's significant improvement in those last four words. The normal serial position effect that we'd expect to get is a little messed up because there's been so much attention specifically targeted at the last four words. And so in essence, if you count the number of rehearsals, you're getting this kind of an effect. That is, I'm misspeaking here, this is a rehearsal curve, not a serial position curve. And what you get is, with each individual word, the further down the list you go, the lower the number of rehearsals. And that would normally happen without those make sure you pay attention to the last four instructions. Rehearsals simply drop. Several different reasons why this may happen. For instance, if you lose position, if you're trying to learn something as a serial list and you lose position, what most people will tend to do is go back and concentrate on the ones at the beginning, the ones they remember. So they tend to over-rehearse the initial ones. So in this study, the intent was to actually over-rehearse the last ones, encourage rehearsal of the last item. So what's counted here is simply number of rehearsals, and this is what happened with those who did immediate recall. In the situation where you had the delayed recall, with a 20-second delay, you can see there's a whopping increase in the number of rehearsals that were actually done. That is, they followed the instructions. They did the rehearsal during that 20-second delay. So then we look at, what did we actually get in terms of recall of the information? And if the recall was immediate, you've got a kind of a warped serial position effect here. Okay, that is, we might expect this one would be down around this position somewhere. That is, you'd be essentially a smooth or relatively ragged line going up from this point to this one. Not quite what happened, but you're seeing here the effects of the overall rehearsal, and that last, the items were rehearsed up to, remembered I should say, up to as much as 6 times more than the ones that had not been rehearsed. 20-second delay causes almost no difference. There's a very slight but non-significant difference in the recall, and essentially you see the same function in both cases, and that is that recall is very good for those last 4 items, specifically when you were given encouragement to rehearse them. So the 20-second delay really had very little difference on immediate recall in this situation. In the final recall of all 144 words, all effects of extra rehearsal simply disappeared. Okay? That is, if you look at across the 144 words, and now what we're aggregating across here is all 12 lists. If you look at the serial position in each of the 12 lists and ask yourself, given the first word across each of the 12 lists, what were the odds that they could recall it? You see that what happens here is that in plotting final recall, the serial position effect simply disappears. It's not there. There is a tendency for the first word to be very well remembered, probably because we put a lot of extra attention on that as a means of trying to remember all 12 of the words. That was kind of one of the many problems that Ebbinghaus faced when he originally started doing that. But really what it does is to suggest the importance of both maintenance and elaborative rehearsal, as we're going to define those a little bit later. But in essence, another study was done by Rundus in the early 70s, in which he gave subjects a list of 20 nouns at a rate of 1 item every 5 seconds. So there was time to rehearse them. But he required the subjects to fill the 5-second interval with rehearsal. Any items from the list could be utilized, but of course the intent was, the expectation was that if you've got 5 seconds an item and realize it fairly shortly, you'll spend 5 seconds rehearsing each of the items. Free recall after the list was again presented. And what happens in that situation is, and I'm jumping ahead of myself here. Oh, what I wanted to point out here was that the recall, I should have given you this a little bit earlier. That's what I get for dividing all these things out. But this is the delayed recall in the previous experiment. Remember, 12 words, 12 lists of 12 words, rehearsed to a perfect recitation, and then surprise at the end, you have to recall them back. And it turns out here the delay had essentially no effect on final recall. Okay? Now, the one that I did want to show you is essentially this one, and that is the data out of the serial position effect that we're studying here. And we can even look at it in terms of the number of rehearsals that has this kind of an effect, okay? Recall is depressed strictly on the serial position dependent. Let me back that up again. I'm getting jumbled in my words. The serial position effect worked, but when we look at the mean rehearsal numbers, they drop consistently. We've seen that in the previous study, and I'm just putting it together here in a slightly different way. In this study that I'm describing by Rundas, they kept track of the number of active rehearsals that occurred. And so what we've got here is a kind of a disconnect, because the serial position curve was found in the studies that he did. It clearly went up at the end of the 20 words, no problem. But look at the number of rehearsals. What that means is essentially that we've got a problem. And that is that number of rehearsals does clearly favor the items at the start of the list, just as we were able to demonstrate from the earlier study. And so you presume that there's a greater amount of rehearsal there. But the primacy effect, which I'll talk about here in a minute, disappears if subjects are instructed to rehearse only the item on the screen. And that was the difference here. That is, when they were asked to rehearse only the item on the screen, the rehearsal tends to go down. Let me back up. I've got too many results to get through today, and I'm getting tongue-tied here. In this study, across the entire list of words, the number of rehearsals went steadily downward, and the problem is the serial position curve went up. How do we explain that? Why do they show good recall? Well, in fact, one explanation that has been offered pretty widely is that what you do here is to credit immediate recall from short-term storage. That is, when you're getting down toward the end of a list, what you can remember is those first items that you may have even over-rehearsed. And so if later on in the list, 5 seconds a turn, but if you think about it a minute, that first, second, third word are very fresh in your memory, and they may pop in and still get the kind of recall. And with free recall, subjects do dump out the last several items before any others. Also, if you recall the Craig and Watkins study that we talked about earlier, that same effect is there. So basically, the serial position effect is going to result from and be credited to two different processes that are going on. One is a primacy effect. That is, that's recall from long-term storage, but those items are easy to identify. They're the beginning of the list, so they're anchored to all the other experiences in the lab and so forth and so on. The items at the end are credited to short-term storage. That is, in that case, what we're illustrating is a recency effect. You can recall the last several items directly out of short-term storage. Now, there is one place where I'm kind of dry on visuals, and I want to anticipate so that you can take a little more careful notes when I'm going through it, but this is not it. Basically, I've got another study I want to describe for you, basically where you present 40 common nouns at the rate of 1 a second. So you're going through 40 words in 40 seconds. That's a bit of a load, okay? Free recall as many as possible immediately afterwards. So you listen to 40 words, 1 a second, and then you're asked to recall any order, as many of the words as you can. And interestingly enough, recall probability of all nouns, as we've already demonstrated, is simply not equal. The earliest nouns enter a relatively unoccupied short-term storage, and they are rehearsed. There's no competition among those earlier nouns. That's another reason why the recall of those first items, the primacy effect, is actually there. This increases the likelihood that they will in fact be moved into long-term memory and stored there, long-term storage. Later nouns at the end of the list, illustrated by the recency effect, are simply dumped from short-term storage. And so in free recall of serially presented material, we're finding 3 different processes that are going on. The first is that we dump the last items first, and in free recall you will notice that. The end items are the very first ones that are spit out. Second, we dump the first items, benefited from the earlier rehearsal, the unimpeded rehearsal, and the ease of moving them into long-term memory. And then what we tend to do is spend the last part of our time dumping as many items as we can find from anywhere, wherever they've been stored, in the middle of the list. And it is then possible, the question is it possible to design experiments that will actually hinder or benefit any one or another of those typical results? And in fact, it is. Postman and Phillips in 1965 did a rather interesting experiment which turned out to bear significantly on this particular issue, again sorting out the relative contribution of short-term and long-term memory. And in essence what they did was to present lists of 10, 20, or 30 words at the rate of 1 a second. Word, another second, another word, and so forth. And then they simply measured immediate free recall. And the results that they get in this situation look like this. And I want to point out a couple of things to you. First of all, we find that the free recall is best with the shortest list. The worst recall is almost 50% even for the middle items. Okay, on the shortest list, recall in the middle still drops to about 50% relative to the 80 or 85% attention or performance that we get. So I'm talking here and here versus here. So it's a classic serial position effect, remembering that we're working with only 10 items in this particular situation. What we find is that free recall is less good for 20 and slightly worse for the 30-word lists. And what I mean by that is not the endpoints. Those are high uniformly. But what's really being talked about here is the difference between this bottom, around 50%, this spell of performance, which is down around 20%, and this one in the 30-item list that drops down to the teens. Okay, so that's what I'm really talking about when I talk about the fact that we find that free recall is less good for the 20 and slightly worse for the 30 words when that's the number that are presented. So if you count words that are recalled from the end of the list, 5 to 7 show improvement above average of the mid-list recall rate. Okay, so if you count back from here, 5 to 7 words, so we're going from 10 back to about 3 or 4. In this case, we're going from 20 back to about, 14, 15. And in the last list, this one I simply smoothed because it was the data was took too long to plot. But again, if we go back 5 to 7 words, we're back around this range. And you can see that recall is down not too different from the mid-list low point that we always find. Okay? So essentially, the second part that was borrowed from the Petersons, the second part of this experiment, presented the 10, 20, and 30-word lists, but then what they did was to impose 30 seconds of reverse number counting and then cue recall. Okay, so I'm combining two different research strategies here. The one was a straightforward give you a word, a word list of 10, 20, or 30 words, 1 per second, and then immediate recall. And now what they're going to do is the same study with one significant change, and that is they're going to impose, as the Petersons did, backward counting or number counting, reverse number counting for 30 seconds and then cue recall. And the results have been replicated several times. Just a reminder of what that experiment was like. And the data that we find looks like this. Look at what's happened to the serial position effect. We've demonstrated that it occurred at 10, 20, and 30-word lists, but look at it, it's absolutely disappeared. We find that recall of lists tends to start slightly lower. That is, you notice the best that was achieved with a 10-word list was 70 rather than 80, and the starting points of each of the other two, if you go back and compare them in your notes, are lower, are still lower. But look at what's happened at the end of the list. There's absolutely no rise occurring there. There's no recency effect at all. That is, the items essentially decayed and were gone from short-term storage. And so if we look then at the serial position effect, to a certain extent I'm gilding the lily here. I'm saying the same thing, but I want to make sure that you understand the effect. And that is that when we look at serial position effect, we're essentially going to argue that there are two things going on here. Whoops, am I going backwards in these slides? That's not what I meant to do. Not quite yet. Pardon me a second. Okay, I guess I didn't get time to put the labels on. Number one is that because of short-term storage, we may keep some of the words in a list, certainly at least the letters in a word, in short-term storage once we've completed the list. So the upward turn at the end is pretty easily demonstrable as a recency effect. Witness in the Postman study, it was eliminated by eliminating that ability to dump out of short-term memory. And if we utilized free recall, then we expect to see subjects dumping the last words in a serial list first, before anything else happens. If we use serial recall, there are other factors that are also intended to contribute. For instance, items at the end of a list are more distinctive because they're near the end of the list. You're already getting the whoopee effect. I'm almost done. I remember that one is near the end. They're not linked only to other words, but also to whatever it is that identifies a list's end, and they are unique in that way. It's not as simple as items being in short-term memory, because certainly in learning a list of words, you're exposed to each of them, and each of the other words intervenes between successive presentations of a specific word. So if you estimate the capacity of short-term memory by simply counting words performed that are recalled at the end of a list, it's ingenious, but it's not a clean measure. It's confounded by the other things that are going on in serial position effects or in serial learning. So the average number of correct front and back of the list is essentially identical. That is, if you look at the curves, there's a slight favoring towards short-term memory. And that's probably because of the interference effects that are built in when you're reciting the items at the beginning of the list. Yes, the goal is to store them in long-term memory so you can retain them till the end of the list, but there is also some interference that's going on there. So that's the likely reason that when you look at a pure serial position effect across any serial study, you're going to find that the end items do tend to be, let me put it this way, the last item tends to be better recalled on average than the first item. They're close, but in fact the last item tends to be better. And secondly, of course, as I've already said, if a subject screws up on the list, what they typically will do is go back and spend markedly more time rehearsing those first few items, indeed over-rehearsing them. And so serial recall was basically initially initiated to correct that, to eliminate that possibility, to prohibit people, that is, to keep them focused on the individual item. And of course, one of the lessons as we move into Tulving's model and things beyond there is that we may have thought we were controlling what the subjects are doing, but in fact, subjects are quite independent beings, and so that rehearsal does tend to go on even in a carefully structured task like serial position effects. So the issue then is working memory and long-term storage the same? Are they the same processes, or are they different? Separating the two is a long-standing tradition in experimental psychology. I mean, it goes all the way back to discussions of at least as far as William James in 1890. Some would point out that postulated differences are not always observed. Many cognitive processes seem to work in the same way, regardless of whether they may require whether they occur in working memory or in long-term memory. That was among the processes that led to Tulving's presentation or development of the episodic memory, semantic memory, and the procedural memory. One point I meant to mention when I was discussing that, it's an easy one to add into your notes. Think about it for a second. Of those three memories, which one is impacted by amnesia? You know, we have stories here every now and then. I remember there was one a couple of years ago of a NASA engineer who was in apparently what turned out to be a not particularly desirable marriage. And he left the house one day and simply disappeared. He left to go to work, and apparently he had a disconnect between where he was headed and memory of how to get there and so forth. And they found him about 2 weeks later in Orlando when he applied to one of the subcontractors there for a job using the engineering skills that he still had. That's in procedural memory. But what is impacted then? Which memory is impacted by amnesia? And that, of course, is going to be episodic memory, because that's the memory of individual events. You know, when you meet somebody who's suffering amnesia, you can still talk to them. Their semantic memory has not been impacted at all. They know the language. They haven't forgotten the N words or verbs or adjectives or anything like that. It's simply an episodically related difficulty that you have. And so for that, those kind of things are cited as justification for such as identities such as Tulving has done with episodic, semantic, and so forth. Another question related to that overall issue is coding in working memory always acoustic or phonetic? That is, as we shift into an analysis of long-term memory, let's look back at the nature of what's actually stored in short-term storage here just briefly, because that's going to help us in terms of what actually is ultimately stored. Most have argued that all of the input is converted into acoustic or phonetic code. That is, that we tend to, even when we're reading, we tend to convert it into acoustic code, as you heard me talking in the last lecture. A procedure developed by Schulman was an interesting test of that. This goes all the way back to 1972, but it's a revealing study. What the subject did was to view 10 words at 500 milliseconds each. So you saw 10 words in 5 seconds, just blink, 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 right through the list. And it was followed immediately by a probe word. And you had been prepped beforehand by the following challenge. Does the probe word match one in the list of 10 that you just viewed? So that's the operating question that you're always, that you're looking at, in terms of which you're looking at the words. Now, a match in this case, in some cases, on some trials, the issue was, is it identical? Is the word that we present as our test an exact match for one of the words that you just saw? On other trials, the issue was simply, was it a synonym of the word that was in the list? And so what you can see is they're separating out the phonetic similarity from the semantic similarity. Okay, a very ingenious way of doing that. So again, here 10 words in 5 seconds, and then a probe word where you have to answer the question, does this exactly match? Or in other cases, is this a synonym? And the way they cued that, so that you didn't, and it's ingenious the way this was done, but the original intent was to not bias the subject at all. So they had to do the normal processing to keep those 10 words in mind. And so the cue as to whether what we're testing for in this case is identity as opposed to a synonym is not actually presented until after the list itself has been presented. So you run through 10 words in 5 seconds, then you see in the corner of the screen an S or an I, and that's the question that you're then to ask when the match word comes up. Okay? The prediction would be that there'll be no confusion if the probe is only a semantic relation to a word in the list. If such confusions do occur, they have to be based on semantic similarity, not on acoustic similarity. And in fact, I guess I do have these results. No, I don't. I'm going to have to simply describe this to you. Come back to me and we'll talk about this a minute. That's what you get for doing things in a rush. But essentially, if the signal identify match and the probe is not a synonym, the errors are about 0.11. I'll go through this twice because there's a lot of data I'm going to hit here. I wish I had a table to show you. Sorry about that. Maybe we'll add one into the images here later. If the signal identity match and the probe is a synonym, the error rate or the false positive is about 0.19. So in terms of identity matching, it didn't matter whether it was not a synonym or a synonym. It was still about 0.19, that is a 0.15 to 0.19. If, on the other hand, the signal was synonym match and the probe is a synonym, the hit rate is about 0.65. Though there's slight evidence of improvement across the 10 items position in the, remember, 10 words right in a row, and there's some slight evidence that the ability to match goes up the further through the list they are. In general, if there were acoustic encoding, we'd expect a decrease in errors in the last 3 or 4 positions, and that simply was not found. Okay? So that what we conclude in all from this study is essentially that the subjects had encoded the words by semantic properties, not acoustically. All right? And so the subjects were probably encouraged to encode semantically in this particular study, given the emphasis on semantic matching under certain conditions, synonyms being the key. But left to their own, the subjects instead do tend to fall back to acoustic encoding. Intrusion errors in short-term memory, if you think about it, always tend to be acoustic. You think about people that make speaking errors. You know, they're 2 or 3 words ahead of themselves, which tells us how far ahead we are normally. When I'm processing the words that I'm enunciating right now, I'm only about 2 or 3 words ahead of where I'm actually talking at this point. But if you think about it, when people screw up, do a spoonerism of some sort, it tends to be sound on which that basis occurs. They don't tend to substitute the wrong synonym or something like that. Okay, it tends to be an acoustic error. Okay, so the processing system seems to produce many codes almost simultaneously. And it isn't clear that these codes necessarily differ in working memory or in long-term memory. So let's look then at a basis for forgetting. The basis in short term is decay through disuse. Now, we kind of shied away from decay as the overall explanation, but in working memory, it is decay that's operating. The particular, we can go all the way back to the classic Peterson study where we presented, that's probably why I had that slide in there. We present the initial 3 letters and then have you doing something else for 18 or 20 seconds as you do not get to rehearse ZJM, ZJM, and so forth. And the net result is we find that very smooth dropping curve where it's back down to chance level in about 15, 18 seconds. So it is decay that's actually operating in that situation. In long-term memory, we will be able to show you pretty convincingly that interference is what's involved there. So there is a potential role even in working memory as indicated by the following. As you remember, I haven't given you these details, but let me just fill in one other missing piece of information in the description of the Peterson study, and that is that in order to get the subject up to speed in terms of see a trigram, see a number, and immediately start counting backwards a second later, they gave the subjects 2 practice trials with a trigram, the counting backwards, and some short period in which to do so. What Keppel and Underwood pointed out was that the Petersons had actually used those 2 practice trials, and they were arguing that that might have biased that kind of smooth dropping effect that we get. And sure enough, what they did was to repeat the Petersons' technique with no practice trials. And what they found was the retention on trial 1 was greater than on trial 2, which was greater than all the later trials. So even though the Petersons talk about a decay function in the recalling of any given item, if you look across items, what Keppel and Underwood were actually able to demonstrate was the fact that the recall was much greater in the first practice trial than in the second practice trial, and in both cases it exceeded the recall that they got on any of the following practice trials. So interference is still there. It's still going on, even in that design that was clearly intended mainly to isolate the effects of decay. In that case, so that we traditionally believe working memory is essentially at a very short capacity level. We've already talked about George Miller and the magic number 7, plus or minus 2. There's one study that I found in the reviews here and going back through some of the classic literature that just blew my mind. Think about this. There was a study done in 1980. We've had one similar to this a little bit earlier, but they worked with one normal undergraduate in an extensive project that lasted about a year and a half, involving some 230 hours of practice that was expended here. By the end, you think about if I read you numbers as I did in the short-term memory section, recall is not that great for you and I. We can 7, 8, 9 if we're lucky and not interrupted at all. This person, believe it or not, by the end could listen to a sequence of random digits read at the rate of 1 per second and reproduce strings of up to 80 numbers long perfectly, flawlessly. Could you do that? Could I just read out 80 numbers to you and have you pour them out? It's a stunning effect, but in essence, we've already seen one example of what's going on there in some of the work we looked at earlier, and that is that by studying the rate at which the subject produces recall, it was discovered that there are a couple of things going on. First of all, what he uses is a very elaborate 3-level chunking system based on units, each of which is 3 to 5 numbers long. So in listening to that row of numbers, what he does then immediately is to break it down into some substitute for each successive string. Now you think about that, he's already gotten 80 back to 16. 80 by 5 is 16. That's getting down into the range of practicability here, okay? And secondly, what he did was to use his normal short-term memory system by recalling the last 5 digits directly from short-term memory with no chunking. So in fact, we've cut the 80 to 16 to 15. So these are just some of the strategies that the subject all by himself developed out of this thing. So you and I are active processors of this information. Best, in fact, concluded relative to this overall issue that we know that the brain establishes an active encoding of incoming stimuli. Okay, we also know that the onrush of continuing incoming stimuli forces our brain to move on to encode by whatever manner the newly arrived stimulation. That is, the pressure that you and I get ourselves in any verbal interaction is nonstop. I mean, you get into a conversation, you've got to stay up with it or you look dumb. And you're doing it. You have to process the information. What strategy are you going to use? For long-term storage of incoming stimuli, what the brain has to do is to form a different configuration or pattern of neural activity, some way to isolate it. And herein is what I think is the most insightful comment in summarizing a lot of the research we've looked at in the last couple of days. I'm going to say it twice so you've got to think about it, so you've got time to think about it. To recall the information later that has been presented, for instance, in a series, the brain has to reestablish that original configuration, whatever it was that you did, and that may give us our experience of long-term memory, where the ongoing immediate configuration yields our experience of short-term or working memory. Think about that a minute, because what it's really doing is taking all the capacity research that we've been talking about, and it totally converts it into processing, and that really
is the key element of memory as we understand it now. Let me read it again. To recall the information later, the brain must reestablish that original configuration, whatever has been stored, and that may give us our experience of long-term memory, where the ongoing immediate configuration yields our experience of short-term memory and working memory. Okay? So that what's happened there is that we've taken all this quantity data and converted it back into an explanation based on recall data. Now let's get back to the screen and begin to show you some things here. I want to turn to the storehouse of original configuration and look at memory codes that are used for recall. And one of the ones we're going to talk about is essentially distinctiveness. One effect we've already done is to look at the extent that elaboration works as a cue for effective recall. But do you remember your first kiss? That was not something you had to rehearse. You did not have to ask that person to step back from and, let's do this again. I want to practice it a couple of times so I'll remember it. It simply is there. You can still recall when that occurred, period. What's done that for us is its distinctiveness. I mean, in our memory, our first kiss is just that. It's the first time we kiss somebody other than an immediate member of the family. And so what that event has is a high measure of distinctiveness. Okay? It's a measure of an item's distinguishability from other items in its appearance or meaningfulness. That is, I guess it's okay as a definition. I was thinking maybe I would substitute the word uniqueness, a measure of an item's uniqueness from the other items in appearance or meaningfulness. But in essence, that definition of distinctiveness allows us then to look at a number of different ways in which we can actually alter the distinctiveness of particular material. And so in essence, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a list on screen here, and I'm going to give you 10 seconds in which to study it. I'd like you to look at it, rehearse it as much as, oh, wait a minute, I want to give you a definition first. Hang on a second. Let's look at 4 different types of distinctiveness, which is what I want to spend the rest of the lecture looking at here today. One of which is primary distinctiveness, okay? And I want to give you an illustration of that. I'm going to give you now, what I'm going to do is to give you a list of 10 words, and I'm going to give you 10 seconds to study that list. Can you guess there's going to be a recall measure here in a minute? Put those pens down. You don't get to write them down. Okay. Here we go. 10 seconds. Phil, take that off the screen. How many can you recall?
6.
Now you can write them down if you want. How many do you think you can remember from that list?
6.
Phil, let me set up. I forgot to put a blank slide. I realized as the screen went up that I forgot to put a blank slide in there. So I'm going to do the same thing for another list here in a minute, on for the 10 seconds, and then I'll take it off when I say now. Would additional time help you, or shall we go ahead and go on with the other part of the demonstration? Okay, everybody's pretty well done writing. Now let's try, I'm going to give you 10 seconds on this list. Time's up, we'll remove it. And now write down that list. How many can you remember? Okay. What is the first word that you wrote down on the list? Was it cantaloupe or was it apple? Did any of you fail to recall cantaloupe? So we've got 100% performance there. Okay? In essence, that is exactly the demonstration of what's called primary distinctiveness. That is, the one larger word just stands out. You can put it back on the screen again so we can look at it, but that one word just stands out in that context because everything else is what is it, 32 type or something, and that one is 48 or 60 or some much larger number, and so it stands out. That is an illustration of primary distinctiveness. But we've got a second factor that also becomes important here, and that is not primary distinctiveness, but rather, you can kind of see it coming here, secondary distinctiveness. And that one we're going to perform or define in a related way. That is, there's another way in which words can differ from one another, and that is their form or their sound. So we basically define secondary distinctiveness as basically the ability to differentiate a subject item from others in long-term storage. How do we differentiate it in terms of secondary characteristics? Their form, their sound, any of those. And so secondary distinctiveness well, let me put it another way. The primary distinctiveness, Q, is much more directly physical. It's kind of in your face kind of difference. The secondary distinctiveness may or may not be in your face. And let me give you an example of the kind of things I'm talking about here. One of the types of distinctiveness that we can talk about as a form of secondary distinctiveness is what's called orthographic distinctiveness. And I'll give you some examples of what I'm talking about here. Okay? Khaki, let me jump ahead here. I've got another screen that will, I hope, do that. Darn it, I know I created a visual. Let me back off the screen for just a second and look, because I've got a better way to illustrate this for you, I think, buried in the materials here, and I'm not going to be able to find it here right away on the fly in the lecture. Yes, I will. We'll come back in here. And we'll come back on screen. Pardon the interruption here. How am I going to get to that starting mechanism? I can't get to the image. Okay, Phil, have you got any suggestion on how I get this bar out of the way so I can get to the... Okay, alrighty. Except I can't get to the bottom. Upper menu. Where do we go? Slideshow, there we are. View slides. How direct, how simple. So now we're going back to day one. Let's try this again. Okay, well, we've messed up this entire lecture. We might as well spend the rest of the time trying to get this straightened out, because there's some stuff I do want to talk about here. Let me put this one on the screen, and we can do it without the ink annotations if we need to here. Let's get rid of that so we can see what's involved. But orthographic distinctiveness is essentially what's illustrated here. Words like khaki, syzygy, that's my favorite all-time word, not a single vowel in it by normal definition. Surfeit, tithe, all of those are unusual words by normal definition, okay? On the other hand, and part of what creates that is the fact that they're orthographically distinctive. You can look at any of them, and it is immediately obvious that they're physically different from one another. And then, in fact, if we look at the other side, which and orange and sparrow and catch are much more kind of typical English words for you and I, and we could in some way label them as simply unusual, if I could be tolerated that word. But that's a difference in the orthographic feature or distinctiveness of the word. Now, there are a couple of ways in which we can get rid of that factor. Okay? There are a couple of ways in which we can eliminate that. One is, for instance, to type it in all caps. If we type khaki and syzygy and surfeit and tithe in caps, a lot of the difference tends to disappear. It gets muted. And certainly which, orange, sparrow, and catch are totally going to go away in that kind of a situation. The other thing that you can do, if you think about it a minute, is that you can pronounce the words. I can just say to you, khaki, syzygy, surfeit, and tithe, and you may occur to yourself, it may occur to you that, gee, I've never heard that word. And so it's a new word for you, but it doesn't stand out in terms of normal usage as these do in terms of their physical characteristic. I think the best single example of that is the syzygy element. Let me put another example on the screen, and that is a different way in which we can get secondary characteristics that in fact differ. And that is in terms of one of my favorite words from English in high school, and that is onomatopoeia, which is essentially a word that sounds like it's referent. And this is a rather interesting cross-cultural discussion to get into with people, because if you talk to people who speak, for instance, Japanese, you will find that they are not quite as impressed with a word like meow or arf is another one that doesn't tend to, that's not so much a good word, but certainly meow is a good example of the fact that you and I tend to think of a cat as envisioned, we've heard Tom and Jerry for years, meow, and so forth. But in fact, if you spell it out in other languages, the word sounds very different when it is pronounced. So onomatopoeia is a kind of an unusual, in that case what you got is the physical characteristics of the word are directly tied to the sound that it's trying to depict, or the image that it's trying to create. So buzz is perhaps one of the better examples there. But even something like crack, because the ACK is very different from the kind of smooth lead-in that you get with a cur sound. Cuckoo, you can in some ways make that almost sound like a cuckoo if you work at it. And whir. All of those are examples where the sound that you make in pronouncing the word do in fact mimic essentially what we're talking about. Now let me see if we can, we haven't been able to figure out how to get the screen working any better, so we'll just show you the working copy here. And that is, there are some memory codes that we can also talk about. A third way in which we can vary the emotional, the distinctiveness of a word is in terms of its emotional distinctiveness. And it's unfortunate I'm not going to be able to present the pictures here. But the definition of emotional distinctiveness is essentially terms which produce intense motivational reactions. Any terms like that. Cuss words in any language become racial epithets in this country are very tender words. They create bad feelings in people of any stripe at whom they are hurled. And they're hurled both directions across any racial barrier of that kind. But that's a word that has emotional distinctiveness, any of the sample of those words. It's among the ones that George Carlin doesn't like us to speak on television. But one thing related to emotional distinctiveness I can definitely identify for you, and that is flashbulb memory. Okay, flashbulb memory is a classic example of the third type of emotional distinctiveness that we can talk about, and that is essentially retention of events based partly on your emotional state when the event occurred originally. If you ask anybody who's my age, mid-late 60s, where they were, who they were with, and what they were doing when they first learned of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, they can tell you. It happened 50 years ago now. They can still tell you, well, is it quite that? Yeah, 40 at least, 45 years ago, a bunch of time. I was in graduate school, so it's at least 45 years ago. And in essence, I can take you to the counter that I was sitting at when I was eating. I can tell you that I was eating an egg salad sandwich when I first heard on the TV. There was a TV overlooking the lunch counter, and that was when the news broke in with news that he had been shot, not initially killed, but the initial news was simply that he'd been shot. But that's an example of a flashbulb memory, where the memory itself is so emotion-laden that you tend to retain it. And yet the interesting thing is that if you go back 10, 15 years and read in the literature, flashbulb memories tend to be described as like etched permanently into our brain. They don't turn out to be. Many aspects of that memory over time tend to experience exactly the same loss of information effect as you can get with any information that is ultimately stored through short-term memory into long-term memory. And so the flashbulb memory effect, in many ways, the key word there is memory. Flashbulb is really describing the onset of the information, but it turns out the loss of the information over time is fairly consistent. Can you, for instance, identify where you were and what you were doing when you first learned that the Challenger had exploded? That is, interestingly enough, beginning to fade as a flashbulb memory. But the Challenger explosion, do you remember what you were doing when you first learned that that had happened? And in fact, I can see around the room there are a couple of heads that are nodding no. But I'll give you another one that I guarantee you're going to have a reaction to, and that is the 9/11 disaster. I'll bet you know where you were and who you were with and what you were doing when you first learned that that plane had plowed into the first tower. And I originally remember when I first saw that, for several minutes I just thought that it was absolutely dumb that a pilot had run into a plane in New York when there were 3 airports nearby, and I was strictly rationalizing it in terms of how do we explain that kind of an event. And then the longer I thought about it and realized, where the thing had hit, about, 15, 20% of the way down the building, it became increasingly clear to me that no, something else is going on here. And that, of course, was confirmed when the second plane hit by that time. But that's an example of where the emotions that are wrapped up in that particular event just make it a very memorable event for us. And yet what it turns out when you study that and ask people to recall it, you tend to get a process called confabulation. That is, what happens is they tend to work, the details begin to blend into each other. And while, yes, you remember this significant event, because we must have seen that plane that shot of the plane flying right into the side of the building, who knows how many times in the days following that initial event. So that one has simply been majorly practiced in our head, majorly, listen to me, practiced in a major way in our head. But the net effect is still that we lose many of the details that are associated with it after the initial event, just like any of long-term memory. And the final one that I want to look at today is what's called mood congruence. And we define mood congruence as the positive impact of similarity of emotional state with the material to be learned. Okay? So at the time of recall, if your emotional state tends to match the state that you were in when you learned the material, the recall in general tends to be better. Blaney, in the late 80s, did a study in which he studied moods in 2 different ways. In one case, what he did was to study people whose moods differ. Are those who are perpetually depressed better or worse at recalling depressing things? And it turns out they're better. May just be a practice effect. And then if you manipulate the mood and then check for recall, what you find is the people who are happy recall more happy things. It's kind of the reverse of what you find with people who are depressed. Even notice that when you go out with friends to a restaurant, and I'll give you a classic example, I can predict what happens. When you go to a restaurant, one of the major things that you talk about is what? If you think about it a second, when you go to a restaurant, even with a significant other or with a larger group or something, there's one factor that tends to be discussed there more than anywhere else. And you're going to recognize this as soon as I say it, other restaurants. What we tend to do when we're sitting in a given restaurant is we talk about, this food isn't as good as, and we name another one, or this is better than, and we name another one. But being in that environment tends to elicit out of us a lot of comment built around what's the nature of the restaurant itself that we're in. And so we talk about, and the other thing that I would put high on that list is essentially food. We also tend to talk a lot about food because it's present in the environment there. One of my sons, and I won't identify which one, but when he was angry or mad as he was growing up, one very quick way to break through that, because he was stubborn, is to simply not let him talk until he puts a smile on his face. And so then you see this very interesting series of caricatures that you go through where he's sitting there fussing with himself, a toy that didn't work or something that didn't go right with a playmate or something or other, and he comes in furious. And then he has to take that internally and reflect it outside with, and that's very hard to do. Try it yourself next time. You get in a bad mood, force yourself to put a smile on your face. And it's just, things are not right. You're giving all these covert signals that aren't reflecting what's actually going on. But in fact, it works. We could snap him out of that kind of bad mood very quickly. And what we've ended up with is a young man who is much more optimistic, a son who is much more optimistic in his overall outlook. And in fact, the final one I'll probably have time to get into here is what is called mood state dependence. And by mood state dependence, what we're essentially doing is formalizing what I've been talking about, and that is the interrelationship between emotional state at time material is learned and emotional state when material is to be recalled. And there's a lot of research on this. This has been an area of conflicted results, however, interestingly enough. Matlin's summarized work up until the 90s in an earlier edition in which she noted that a moderately positive relationship tends to exist. That is, It's more likely with real life events, probably where emotional tone was an element of the experience itself. That is, that emotion, when it's reestablished, tends to recall your memories in that situation. And it's also more likely with adults, that is, emotional recall of this kind, where the experience in moods importance has been gained. We understand the importance of moods in a given situation. But from your own life, I can give you a specific example, and that is banks will sometimes pass out these Christmas, or not even just banks, anybody, will pass out a card where you can scratch something, or I'll give you another example, perfume ads, where they will put a card in an envelope, and what you're invited to do is just scratch a fingernail across something and smell it. And one of the ones that always produces, and I'll be interested to see what you get, is the one where when you scratch that dot, what you get is an evergreen smell. You get an evergreen smell, trees or something like that. Is there any specific event that tends to call forth in you? Because in my situation, it always creates an image of a Christmas that we had in my home when I was, 10 or 11 years old. But I remember that was one of the first times I'd really concentrated on the smell of a balsam tree, and so now when I scratch one of those little circles of tree smell, that is what always comes to mind as Christmas related. So we'll pick this up with a stunning array of visuals next time as we continue through the fourth item, which will involve processing distinctiveness.